"You will not go down those stairs," said the woman in the doorway, and the key turned in the lock with a sound like a small bone breaking. "Not tonight. Not while my carriage stands at the door. Not while there is a single soul of consequence beneath this roof. Do you understand me, girl? You will sit in the dark, and you will be grateful for it." On the other side of that door, Ottilie Quennell said nothing. Gerald, Duke of Kesbeck, standing 3 paces down the corridor with his gloves half drawn on and his patience wholly spent, heard only the silence that followed, and it was the silence that arrested him, more than the cruelty that had come before it. He had known a great many people in his 38 years who could not endure to be scolded without some sputter of protest. He had known none who could be locked away from their own house and answer with nothing at all. He had come to Marrowfield Hall against every instinct he possessed. Came became because his solicitor had pressed him, because the estate marched with his own along the river's northern bend, and because Mrs. Balfour Quennell, the woman now pocketing the key with the satisfaction of a cat that has trapped a moth, had written him 4 letters in as many weeks, each more honeyed than the last, each contriving to mention her stepdaughters and their accomplishments and the particular softness of the evening air upon the terrace. He had answered none of them. He had come only when a matter of drainage and a disputed weir made his refusal impossible without insult, and he had promised himself he would be gone by the following noon. Now he stood in a shadowed passage above the great staircase, watching his hostess descend toward the light and music with her skirts hissing, and he found he could not make his own feet follow. "Your Grace," she had seen him. Her whole face rearranged itself in an instant, the soreness smoothed away beneath a wide, glistening smile. "Forgive me, servants. One never has a moment's peace. You must think us the most disordered household in the county." She came back up 2 steps toward him, her hand extended as though she might take his arm, and the diamonds at her throat caught the candlelight and threw it about like something spilled. "You will let me present my daughters to you below. Cornelia has been practicing the new Italian songs this whole fortnight only for the hope of it." Gerald looked at her hand and did not take it. He was accustomed to being looked at with hunger. He had felt it in ballrooms from Bath to the border, the swift sidelong measuring of a man who was a duke, unwed, and in possession of 40,000 a year. He had learned to wear it the way other men wore an ill-fitting coat, with a stiffness that most mistook for pride, and only a very few understood for what it was, which was a wound that had never properly closed. 6 years gone, he had loved a woman for her laughter and married her for it, and buried her within the 12-month, and learned at the graveside from her own sister's careless grief that the latter had been given him for his lands and never once for himself. He had not made the error of being charmed since. He did not intend to begin under this roof. There was someone at that door, he said. Mrs. Quennell's smile held, but something behind it flinched. "A servant girl, Your Grace. Wilful. I keep her from the company for her own protection. She is not accustomed to society, and she shames herself when she attempts it. You are all kindness to notice, but she is quite beneath your concern." She did not sound like a servant. They so seldom do these days. She laughed, a bright brittle sound, and this time she did lay her fingers upon his sleeve, and this time he stepped back so that they fell away. Her eyes narrowed by the width of her hair. Then the smile came back, thicker than before. "Come down, Your Grace. The Corlisses are here, and Sir Anthony, and half the neighbourhood besides, all of them perishing to meet you. It would be unkind to keep them waiting on a locked scullery door." He went down. He told himself he went down because there was nothing else to be done. Because a man could not stand in a corridor all night contesting the disposition of another man's household. Because the girl behind the door was in all likelihood exactly what she had been called, and his own weariness was inventing a mystery to relieve the tedium of the evening. He told himself these things and did not believe a word of them, and he carried the memory of that silence down the stairs with him like a stone in his coat. The drawing rooms of Marrowfield were ablaze. Every candle in the house had been pressed into service, and the light lay thick and gold upon a company got up in its finest. The country gentry in their good silk, the matrons flashing what jewels their strong boxes could yield, the young ladies arranged along the walls in their pale muslins like a border of cultivated flowers. A murmur went through them all as he entered. That particular ripple he knew so well. And then they were upon him, Mrs. Quennell steering, and the introductions coming one after another, names he let pass through him without lodging, hands he touched and released. "And this," said his hostess, with the air of a jeweller unwrapping her finest stone, "is my Cornelia." The girl who curtsied before him was undeniably handsome. She had her mother's colouring warmed by youth, a fine white throat, a gown that must have cost some tenant a year's rent, and eyes that came up to his and held them with a boldness meant to be taken for spirit. "Your Grace," she said, "we had quite despaired of you. The whole county said you would never come so far north for anything less than a war." "The county flatters me," Gerald said. "I came for a weir." Cornelia laughed too quickly and too long, and beside her a knot of young people laughed with her, a pale youth in a coat too tight across the shoulders, and two sisters of the neighbouring Corliss family who wore their gowns like armour and their smiles like drawn blades. He had met their like in every drawing-room in England. They arranged themselves about him and began the work of the evening, which was to be witty, to be seen, to say the practised thing. "You must find us very rustic, after London," said the elder Miss Corliss. "You must be so weary of being told how weary you must be," said Cornelia, and there was another gust of laughter. Gerald answered as the machinery of society required, and watched the flames in the great hearth and thought about a locked door, a servant girl wilful, not accustomed to society. He had been told that lie, or one of its cousins, before. He had heard it from mothers who wished to hide a plain daughter, and from guardians who wished to hide an heiress, and he knew the sound of a thing concealed when it was spoken across a candle. Mrs. Quennell had not concealed the girl. She had displayed the concealing of her. That was a different matter, and it interested him against his will. "Have you sisters, Miss Quennell?" he asked, when a gap in the noise permitted it. The question fell oddly upon the group. Cornelia's smile did not move, but her mother, 2 steps distant and pretending to attend elsewhere, turned her head. "One sister," Cornelia said. "Dane. She is somewhere about. She is very shy." She gestured toward a slight, watchful girl half a head shorter than herself, plainly the younger, who dropped a curtsy and said nothers. "No others, Your Grace." Cornelia's chin lifted. "Why do you ask?" "Idle curiosity." "Your mother spoke of daughters. I supposed there might be more of you than I could see." He said it lightly and watched, and saw the small tightening at the corner of the girl's mouth, and the swift glance she sent toward her mother, and Mrs. Quennell's laugh arriving a half-beat too late, cover the gap. "He means my stepdaughter," said Mrs. Quennell, gliding in, her voice indulgence. "My late husband's child by his first marriage. A dear creature, but not for evenings such as this. She keeps to the still room and the linen, and is happier there than she would ever be here, I promise you. Now, Your Grace, you must hear Cornelia sing before supper. She has the sweetest voice in 3 parishes." So there it was. Not a servant after all, but a daughter of the house set below the servants, a girl with a father's name and a father dead, kept upstairs behind a turned key while the county drank the father's wine. Gerald said nothing of what he thought. He had long ago learned to keep his face a shut door. But he allowed himself to be led to the pianoforte, and he sat, and he listened to Cornelia Corliss sing an Italian song in a voice that was, in truth, very sweet and entirely without a single feeling behind it. And all the while he was fitting together the shape of a household in his mind and disliking, more with each note, the thing it made. The song ended. The company applauded as though a miracle had been performed. And into the little silence that follows applause, before the next voice could rise, there came from the far end of the room the small, clear, unmistakable sound of a door opening that ought to have been locked. Gerald turned with the rest. She stood in the doorway that gave onto the servants' passage, and she was not dressed for a ball. Her gown was grey, plain wool gone soft and thin at the elbows, mended at one cuff with stitches so neat they were nearly invisible and visible to him at once for the care in them. Her dark hair was drawn back without ornament. She carried a covered dish in both hands, held before her like an offering or a shield, and she had plainly not expected to find the assembled county turned as one to stare at her, for she went very still, but she did not flush, and she did not flee, and she did not drop her eyes. That was the thing he marked before he marked anything else. She looked back at them all, at 40 candlelit strangers in their silk, with a composure that had cost her something and that she paid without complaint. Cook asked me to bring these through, she said to no one and to the room. Her voice was low and even. The men were all wanted at the door. Out. Mrs. Quennell was across the floor in an instant, her whisper carrying to every ear that strained for it, "Get out." "How dare you? I locked that door with my own hand." "The bolt is old, madam." The girl set the dish down upon the sideboard with perfect steadiness and turned to go, and it was in the turning that her eyes crossed the room and met Gerald's, quite by accident, for the space of a single breath. She did not simper. She did not shrink and beg to be forgiven the crime of existing. She looked at him as one person looks at another across a distance, gravely without appeal, and then she was gone through the door, and it closed behind her, and the room let out its held breath in a rush of delighted, scandalized murmuring. "You see how it is," Mrs. Quennell said, returning to him with her color high and her laugh working hard. "One does what one can for such a girl, but there is no gratitude in that quarter, and no sense of place. She was ever her father's ruin, and she means to be mine." She pressed her handkerchief to her lip. "You will forgive the interruption, Your Grace. It shall not happen again." "What is her name?" Gerald asked. The question was quiet, but it fell into a lull, and half the room heard it. Mrs. Quennell's handkerchief paused at her mouth. Cornelia, still at the pianoforte, went white about the nostrils. And Gerald, who had not meant to ask it aloud, who had spent six years teaching himself to want nothing that a drawing-room contained, found that he had asked it and would not now unask it. "Ottilie," said the younger stepsister Delphine, before anyone could stop her, a small voice, but it carried. "Her name is Ottilie." "Ottilie," Mrs. Quennell repeated with a laugh like a plate set down too hard, "who is of no consequence whatever, and whom His Grace has been far too gracious to spare a thought. Come, supper is served, and I will not have it grow cold for the sake of a scullery quarrel. Your Grace," your arm to Cornelia. He gave Cornelia his arm, because to refuse it in that moment before that company would have been a public discourtesy he was not yet ready to commit, and he led her into supper. She talked the length of the passage, of the assemblies at the county town, of a milliner in Harrogate who was the only creature in the north who understood a bonnet, of how dull it all was and how she longed for London, each remark shaped and polished beforehand and set out for his admiration like plate upon a table. He answered in monosyllables, and she did not appear to notice, or noticing did not care. She had the trick, he observed, of hearing in every silence the reply she wished for. It was a trick her mother had taught her, and it had been taught, he did not doubt, at the price of some other person's peace. "You are very quiet, Your Grace," she said at last, as he handed her to a chair. "They warned me you would be. They said the Duke of Kestbeck has not smiled since his wife died and does not mean to begin. But I do not believe the half of what they say. I think you have only wanted the right company to draw you out." She looked up at him from beneath her lashes, all confidence, certain of her ground. "You may be right," said Gerald, and sat, and thought that the right company was at that moment 2 floors above them in the dark, and that it would never in its life have said such a thing. He sat through the supper, and he ate what was set before him and answered what was said to him, and let the evening close over the small grey figure in the doorway, as though a stone had dropped through still water and left no ring, but it had left a ring. He felt it widening in him all through the long, glittering, tedious meal, through Cornelia's practised laughter at his left, and the elder Miss Corliss's sly probing questions at his right. Through the toasts and the boasting and the whole warm, reeking pageant of people trying to be agreeable to a duke. He had come north for a weir. He had promised himself he would be gone by noon. He thought of the neatly mended cuff, of the way the girl had held the dish so steadily while her stepmother's whisper flayed her, of the grave and unbegging look she had given him across the room, a look that had asked him for absolutely nothing, which was the one thing in that house he had not been offered all evening, and therefore the only thing he found he wanted. When at last the ladies rose and the men were left to their port, Sir Anthony Corliss leaned toward him over the walnut and the decanters and said, low, with the confiding chuckle of a man sharing a piece of common knowledge, "You mustn't mind the Quennell business, Kestbeck. Bad blood there." The first wife's girl, no portion, no prospects, half wild, they keep her out of the way as a kindness. She'd only shame herself in company. Not a soul in the county receives her. There's nothing to be done for a girl like that. Gerald turned the port slowly in its glass and watched the light move in it. Somewhere above them, behind a bolted door that did not hold, a young woman was sitting in the dark, mending by no candle a cuff that no one would see, having been told to be grateful for it. No portion, Gerald said. No prospects, and no one in the county receives her. Not a soul, Sir Anthony agreed, pleased to be understood. She has nothing, Kestbeck, and she is nobody, and she will die in that still room mending sheets, and it is the kindest end she can hope for. Her father saw to that when he took the second wife and got himself into his grave. There's nothing to be done for a girl like that, and no sense in a man of your standing troubling his head over it. Is there not? He said. It was not a question. Sir Anthony, mistaking the mildness of it for agreement, chuckled again and reached for the decanter, and the talk turned to hounds and to the weir and to the price of northern wool, and the Duke of Kestbeck sat among them with his shut-door face and let them believe he had forgotten her. He had not forgotten her. He would not be gone by noon. He knew it already, sitting there with the port untasted in his hand, knew it with the same cold certainty by which he knew the sound of a lie across a candle and the sound of a truth behind a locked door. That he would not leave Marrowfield Hall until he had spoken, once and plainly, and with no one whispering at his elbow, to the girl in the grey gown whose name was Ottilie. The carriage turned in at the gates of Marrowfield a little after 4, and Gerald, Duke of Kestbeck, felt the old reluctance settle over him like a coat too heavy for the season. He had accepted the invitation only because refusal would have been remarked upon, and being remarked upon was a thing he had spent 11 years learning to avoid. A man who had once been made a public fool did not offer the world a second chance to study his face. The house rose beyond a screen of limes, long and low and prosperous, its windows throwing back the flat gold light of the afternoon. He had heard it called hidden, and he saw now why. The drive doubled on itself twice before it reached the door, as though the place had been built by someone who did not wish to be come upon unawares. He knew the mistress of it by reputation only. Mrs. Quennell, the second Mrs. Quennell, he corrected himself, for the first had died and left a daughter no one seemed able to describe, kept a careful table and a carefuller guest list, and she had wanted a ducat at it the way a jeweller wants a stone to set off the lesser gems around it. He was received in the hall by the lady herself, and she was precisely what he had expected, handsome in the hard, lacquered way of women who had married up and meant to be seen doing it, her welcome so warm it left a faint chill behind. At her shoulder stood a young woman in rose silk, introduced as Miss Cornelia Corliss, a cousin of the house, and Miss Corliss curtsied with the practised deepness of a girl who had been told which men in England were worth the trouble of a low curtsy. "Your Grace does us such honour," Mrs. Quennell said. "We are only a small party. You will find us quite without ceremony." "I am glad of it," Gerald said, which was the only true thing he had said since the gates. Miss Corliss laughed, a bright, ready sound that arrived a half-second before anything worth laughing at. "Mamma says the same, and then contrives to have 3 courses removed and the good candles lit. We shall try not to frighten you with our grandeur, Your Grace." He inclined his head and said nothing, and she took his silence for encouragement, as her kind always did. She walked with him toward the drawing-room, describing the neighbourhood, its assemblies, its dullness, the great one of anyone in it worth speaking to, until, she implied, this afternoon. He let the words go past him. He had heard this precise music in a dozen drawing-rooms, played by a dozen accomplished hands, and he had long ago stopped mistaking it for anything but what it was. A man learned, after his heart had been sold once at auction, to recognize the sound of bidding. It was the tea that undid the arrangement. They had scarcely settled, Mrs. Quennell to his right, Miss Corliss angling her chair so the window flattered her, when a maid came in with the tray and, at the threshold, caught the edge of the carpet and stumbled. The pot did not fall, but a cup did, and the hot tea went across the front of Miss Corliss's silk in a dark, spreading stain. The room went brittle in an instant. Miss Corliss was on her feet with a cry. Her charm dropping from her like a shawl slid off the shoulders, and beneath it was something Gerald had seen before and disliked at once. "You clumsy, wretched creature," she said, low and vicious. And the maid had gone white and was stammering, and Mrs. Quennell was rising with a face like a shut door. And then another woman came through the same doorway with a cloth already in her hand, as though she had been near enough to hear the crash and had not stopped to wonder whether it was her place to answer it. "It is only the muslin under the silk that will mark," she said, kneeling at Miss Corliss's skirts without ceremony, pressing the cloth to the stain with quick, sure fingers. "Cold water within the hour and it will scarcely show. Beatty, fetch the pitcher from the still room, not the kitchen. The kitchen's is too warm." The maid fled grateful, and the young woman looked up. "It was the carpet's fault and mine, Cornelia, for I left the tray's cloth trailing, not hers." Gerald had risen when the ladies did, out of habit, and now he found he had not sat down again. He was looking at her. She was plainly dressed, grey, a workaday grey, the sort of stuff a governess wore, or a poor relation who had been given to understand that her keep was a charity. And her hair was drawn back without a single concession to fashion, and there was a smudge of tea on her wrist where the cloth had not saved her. She was by every measure the room would use, the least of the women in it. And yet she had walked into the middle of a small cruelty and put an end to it in the space of a breath, and had done it without heat, without any apparent knowledge that a duke sat 6 feet away watching her do it. "You need not fuss over it," Miss Corliss said. But the venom had nowhere to go now. The young woman had drawn its poison by taking the blame onto herself, and both of them knew it, and it plainly did not please Miss Corliss to know it. Mrs. Quennell's voice cut across the room, cool and displeased. "Ottilie, you forget yourself. His Grace is present." The young woman rose from her knees. She turned and Gerald had his first proper sight of her face, not a beauty by the fashion of the age, too grave, too still, with a wide clear brow and a mouth that looked as though it had learned to keep its own counsel. And she made him a curtsy that was correct and unhurried and entirely without performance. "Your Grace must forgive me," she said. "I did not mean to bring the still room into the drawing room." "On the contrary," Gerald said, "I have rarely seen a difficulty met so quickly." Something moved in her face, not pleasure exactly, and certainly not the flutter he was accustomed to producing in young women when he chose to be gracious. It was more like surprise, quickly mastered, the look of a person unused to being addressed at all, still less answered civilly. Then Mrs. Quennell said, "You may go, Ottilie," in the tone one used to dismiss a servant, and the young woman went, and the door closed behind her, and the room resumed its previous shape as though she had never entered it. But she had entered it, and Gerald could not, for the remainder of the hour, entirely make her leave. "My husband's daughter," Mrs. Quennell said, following his glance to the door with a smoothness that had clearly been rehearsed against this very question, by his first marriage. "A sad case. She has no accomplishments, no address, no notion of how to go on in company, and so I do not press her into it. It would be a kindness to no one. She is happiest, I think, kept quietly at home." "She did not seem to me unhappy," Gerald said. "Your Grace is generous." The lady smiled. "She is a dear, dull creature, and I am fond of her in my way, but she has been a great deal of trouble to place, and one cannot place a girl who will insist on kneeling in the drawing-room. You see how it is. She has never learned the difference between a household and a home." Miss Corliss had recovered herself and her rose silk both, and now leaned in with the air of one about to be witty at another's expense. "Poor Ottilie. We keep hoping she will take an interest in something suitable, a little music, a little drawing, but she will only read and manage the linen and doctor the tenants' children, which is not at all the same as being useful. Last winter she nursed the gatekeeper's boy through the fever herself." "Can you imagine? A gentleman's daughter?" "Yes," Gerald said. "I find I can." There was a small silence. Miss Corliss looked as though she had reached for a sweet and closed her hand on a wasp. She had expected him, plainly, to laugh with her at the absurdity of a gentler woman with earth under her nails, and instead she found the Duke of Kestbeck regarding her with the particular blankness he reserved for people who had shown him more of themselves than they intended. He knew the look. He had spent a lifetime learning to keep his own face from becoming its opposite. She recovered quickly, her kind always did, and reached for her cup, and found some remark to make about the weather that had lately spoiled the roads, and Mrs. Quennell took it up gratefully, and between them they built a little bridge of talk over the awkwardness and hurried across it. But Gerald had marked the thing he needed to mark. In the space of 3 sentences he had watched Miss Corliss diminish a woman for reading, for nursing a sick child, for being of use, and he had watched Mrs. Quennell smile through it as a gardener smiles at a well-staked plant. Whatever the truth of the daughter kept in grey, these two had agreed upon a version of her between them, a small, safe, pitchable version, and they meant the county to have no other. It was very neatly done. He had seen fortunes hidden with less care than these women hid a girl. Miss Corliss's smile faltered and reassembled itself, and Mrs. Quennell turned the conversation with the deftness of long practice toward the assembly to be held at the house within the fortnight. A ball, she called it, though a modest one, to which of course His Grace must come. The neighbourhood would talk of nothing else. Gerald heard perhaps 1 word in 3. He was thinking that in 11 years of drawing rooms he had learned to read a room the way a sailor reads water, to know at a glance who wanted what of him and what price they meant to charge for the wanting. And the one person in this house who had wanted nothing of him at all had been sent out of it within a quarter hour of his arrival. He did not see her again that afternoon. He was honest enough with himself to admit that he looked once at the window as his carriage was brought round, half expecting to catch the grey of her dress somewhere at the edge of the grounds. He did not, but as the drive doubled back on itself the second time, the carriage passed close to a low-walled garden behind the stables, and there she was on her knees again, this time in the black earth of a bed of late herbs, a basket beside her and her sleeves turned back, working with the same unhurried competence he had watched at Miss Corliss's skirts. She did not look up. The carriage was not loud on the gravel, or she was too absorbed to mark it, and so for the length of a slow breath the Duke of Kesbeck was afforded the rare thing of watching a person who did not know she was watched. There was no performance in her at all. There was only the work of her hands and the tilt of her head, once, a pause in which she pressed the back of her wrist to her brow and looked out across the low wall at nothing, at the flat gold light on the fields, with an expression he could not name and did not stop trying to name for a long while after the garden was out of sight. He told himself, riding home through the lengthening shadows of the limes, that it was nothing, that he had been struck merely by the novelty of a woman who did not angle her chair to the window, that a man who had been hunted for his title, as long as he had, was bound to feel some passing warmth toward the one creature in a houseful who had not tried to catch him, and that the warmth would cool by supper. It did not cool by supper. It did not cool at all. His own house, when he reached it, felt larger and quieter than he had left it, in the way houses do when a man has been reminded that they are empty. He dined alone as he preferred, and dismissed his people early, and sat a long while with a glass he did not drink, before the fire he had not asked to be lit. He was not a man given to reverie. He had trained it out of himself deliberately. The year after Lady Selene Farthingham had accepted him with tears of joy in her eyes, and married his fortune with dry ones the moment his back was turned, and had let all the world know before the year was out that she had never for a moment cared for the man inside the coronet. He had been 26 then, and he had believed her, and he had never quite forgiven himself the believing. Since that day he had approached every soft look and every ready laugh as a magistrate approaches a plea, assuming, until proven otherwise, that it wanted something of him. Nothing about the afternoon should have troubled that long habit, and yet, Ottilie, even the name had been thrown at her like a reprimand. Ottilie, you forget yourself. He turned it over. He thought of the cloth already in her hand as she came through the door, which meant she had not paused to ask whether the matter concerned her, of the way she had said not hers, taking the blame with the plain economy of a person to whom blame was no new burden, of the smudge of tea on her wrist that she had not troubled to hide. He thought of the mother's smooth account, no accomplishments, no address, happiest kept quietly at home, and of how thoroughly that account had been contradicted by the single quarter hour he had been permitted to observe. A dull creature did not read a stain and prescribe cold, still-room water in one breath. A dull creature did not nurse a gatekeeper's son through a fever. A dull creature was not, he suspected, kept out of every gathering the neighbourhood held. A dull creature would have been safe to display. There had been, too, the matter of the still room, He kept returning to it. A house did not hand its stores and its sick tenants and the management of its linen to a creature it truly believed dull. It handed those things to the one pair of hands it trusted and then took care that the trusting should never be spoken of aloud. Ottilie Quennell, for he had caught the surname now, thrown out once by Miss Corliss like a thing of no account, did the work of the house and was denied the standing of it. She was useful in private and an embarrassment in company, and the two verdicts could not both be honest. One of them was a fiction maintained for a purpose, and Gerald, who had built his own life around the reading of purposes, thought he could guess which. She was being hidden. He was as sure of it as he had been sure of anything in years, and the shorty sat in him uncomfortably, because it was not his affair, and because it made him wish to make it his affair, and he had promised himself long ago that he would never again let a woman's grey eyes decide a single thing he did. He rose at last and went to the window and stood looking out over his own dark park, and admitted to himself the thing he had been holding at arm's length since the walled garden. It was not pity. Pity he could have managed. Pity asked nothing of a man but a little money and a little condescension, and cost him nothing. This was worse. This was interest, sharp, particular, unwilling interest, the wish to know what she had been looking at across the low wall, and what she thought when no one required her to think anything aloud, and whether that grave, still mouth ever opened on something other than the taking of blame. He had come to Marrowfield meaning to endure an afternoon and forget it. He would have to go back now. That was the plain arithmetic of it, and it displeased him, and he could not for his life make himself sorry. The ball was in a fortnight. Mrs. Quennell had all but demanded his attendance, and he found that the prospect which had that morning seemed a tedium to be survived now seemed a thing worth surviving anything to reach, provided that this time the daughter of the house was not sent from the room before he could learn her better. Provided, he thought, that this time she was let stay. He did not sleep well. Somewhere toward the small hours he gave over trying and lay with his hands behind his head and his eyes on the canopy, and he saw, when he closed them, not Lady Celine's face, which had haunted him for a decade, but a smudge of tea on a plain woman's wrist, and the flat gold light lying quiet on the fields beyond a garden wall, and a grey figure who had looked out at it all as though she were memorizing a thing she was not permitted to keep. By morning he had stopped pretending the warmth would cool. He rang for his man earlier than his custom, and asked, with a carelessness that deceived neither of them, what was known in the county of the family at Marrowfield, and most particularly, though he did not say most particularly, what was known of the first Mrs. Quennell's daughter. The one no one had been able to describe, the one he found, now that he could not stop describing to himself. Noon came and went, and the Duke of Kestbeck did not order his horses. He sent word instead to the neighbouring landholder that the matter of the ware wanted a second morning's survey, which was true, and he let it be understood at Marrowfield that he might be prevailed upon to remain another night or two, which was truer than he cared to examine. Mrs. Quennell received the intelligence as a general receives news of reinforcements. Within the hour the whole house was in an uproar of preparation, for she had resolved, she announced at the breakfast table with her hands pressed to her bosom, to give a ball, a proper ball. With the long saloon opened and the carpets taken up and every family of consequence for 15 miles begged to attend on 2 days' notice. It was got up entirely for him, and everyone under the roof knew it, and no one said so, and Gerald watched the servants carry the rolled carpets out into the passage, and thought of the girl who would be set to beating them. He did not see her all that day, nor the next. She was kept below and behind, in the still room and the linen presses, moved about the house like a piece of furniture that must not be in the room when guests arrived. Twice he contrived a reason to pass the servants' quarter. Twice he found only a closed door and the smell of beeswax and the sound, once of a low voice reading aloud to some child of the household in the kitchen, steadily, without hurry, the words of a psalm. He did not go in. He had no right to go in, and he knew it, and the knowing did not lessen by an ounce the pull he felt against it. By the second evening the long saloon at Marrowfield blazed as the drawing-rooms had blazed, but larger, louder, the chandeliers dripping wax upon the boards and the fiddlers scraping in the gallery and the county pouring in through the doors in a river of silk and feathers and hard, bright hope. Gerald stood the receiving of it with the stillness that passed for hauteur, and let the names wash over him, and danced once with Cornelia because there was no decent avoiding it. She danced beautifully, as she did everything, with an eye always upon the room to see who watched her dance it. He returned her to her mother and did not ask her again, and felt the temperature of the house drop by a degree, and did not care. It was near the middle of the evening, in a pause between the sets, that Mrs. Quennell made her error. Flushed with wine and triumph and the particular recklessness of a woman who believes her prize half won, she must needs have Ottilie fetched, not for kindness, never that, but the pleasure of a contrast. To set her drudge beside her daughter in the full glare of the company, and let the county see for itself which was the flower and which the weed. She sent Delphine for her with a whispered word, and Delphine went white and went, and presently there was a stir near the lower door, and the girl in grey was brought into the light of the ball she had been locked away from. They had not even let her change the gown. She stood in the same soft grey wool, mend at the cuff, her dark hair drawn plainly back, amid 100 candles and a sea of gauze and jewels, and the whole glittering room turned to look at her as it had turned before. Gerald felt the old silence come off her across the floor, that composure held at a cost, paid without complaint, and he set down his glass on a passing tray and began, without quite deciding to move toward her through the press. He was not the first to reach her. Cornelia had seen her mother's game and improved upon it, sweeping across the boards with the 2 Miss Corlisses at her flank like a frigate with its escort, and she arrived before her step-sister with a smile of such warmth that only the eyes betrayed the blade beneath it. "Ottilie, how good of you to come up to us." Her voice was pitched to carry, sweet and clear, and the knot of young people who trailed her leaned in to miss nothing. "But my dear, in that, you might have told me, I would have found you something. Though I fear nothing of mine would go round you twice. You have grown so thin, stooping over those sheets. Do you know," she confided to the elder Miss Corliss, not troubling to lower her voice, "she darns the servants' linen herself, with her own hands, for the love of it. Is it not touching? Some girls are born to the needle as others are born to the harp. How fortunate," said Miss Corliss, "that she was born to the one thing that asks no partner." "And no portion," added the younger Corliss girl, emboldened, tittering behind her fan. "For what would a linen maid want with a dowry? She has her thimble. Some of us must scrape together 40,000 a year in gowns and singing masters merely to be looked at, and here she stands and is looked at for nothing in wool. It is quite unfair." There was a ripple of laughter, soft and vicious, and it spread outward through the nearer guests the way cold spreads through water. A gentleman smirked into his glass. A dowager lifted her lorgnette. Ottilie stood in the centre of it with her hands folded before her, and she did not flush and she did not drop her eyes, and Gerald, 3 steps off now, halted by the wall of backs between them, saw that she had chosen, in the half-second given her, not to be wounded where they could watch. "You are all kindness, Cornelia," she said. Her voice was low and level and it did not shake. "It is true I keep the linen. Someone must if the house is to have clean sheets to lie in and clean cloths to dine upon, and I'd rather it were done well than left to spite the family whose name I carry." She let that rest a moment, mild as milk. "As for the needle, you need not pity me it. It is honest work, and it has never once pretended to be my friend the better to laugh at me. I find I have grown fond of it on that account." It was said without heat, almost gently, and for a heartbeat no one understood that it had landed at all. Then they did. The elder Miss Corliss's smile stiffened upon her face. Cornelia's colour rose in 2 hard spots high on her cheeks. The laughter, which a moment before had been running so freely at the grey girl's expense, faltered and turned uncertain, some of it drying up altogether, 1 or 2 of the older listeners exchanging a glance that had shifted, subtly and against all expectation, in the drudge's favour. For she had not railed, and she had not wept, and she had not begged. She had only told the plain truth pleasantly, and let them measure themselves against it, and the measuring did not flatter them. "Well," said Cornelia, with a laugh that came out too thin, "how clever we have become below stairs. Mamma will be so. Miss Quennell has not danced," said Gerald. He had not planned to speak. He had meant only to reach her, to break the ring, to stand where his standing would say what he did not trust his tongue to say without saying too much. But the words came out of him into the little brittle silence, quite level, quite clear, and the whole company heard the Duke of Kestbeck remark, as though it were the most ordinary observation in the world, that a girl in a mended grey gown had not danced. He watched the sentence do its work. It was a small thing, and it was not small at all. To the room it meant only that His Grace had noticed her, but the room lived and died upon what His Grace noticed, and in the space of that one sentence Ottilie Quennell was transformed from a thing to be laughed at into a thing to be reckoned with. Because the greatest man beneath that roof had let it be seen that he counted her among the guests, Cornelia's mouth opened and shut. The Miss Corlisses drew back a pace without knowing they did it. And Mrs. Quennell, arriving breathless at the edge of the group, with her triumph curdling on her face, got out, "Your Grace, she does not dance. She has never been taught. She would only—" "Then she and I are matched," said Gerald, "for I dance seldom and badly, and only when the company is worth the trouble." He turned from the mother to the stepdaughter and inclined his head and held out his hand, palm up, in the full sight of the county. "Miss Quennell, if you will honour me." He saw the war in her. He saw that she understood, better perhaps than he did himself, precisely how much and how little this was, that it would cost her dearly the moment his carriage was out of sight, that it made a spectacle of her either way, that a kindness done before 100 watching eyes is also a kind of exposure. For an instant he thought she would refuse him, and he found he respected her the more for the possibility of it. Then something settled in her face, some private reckoning concluded, and she laid her hand in his worker's hand. He felt at once the palm firmer than any he had touched that night, warm, unsteady only at the very last, and let him lead her out onto the floor. "You should not have done it," she said low, when the fiddlers had struck up and the figure of the dance had drawn them together and apart and together again. There was no reproach in it. It was simply told him, the way she told everything. "You have made me a great deal of trouble. I know it. You knew it and did it, and mean me to be grateful." A ghost of something crossed her face that in a lighter woman would have been a smile. "You are the second person to require my gratitude today, Your Grace. The first was my stepmother, for the loan of a pair of shoes I did not want." "I require nothing of you," Gerald said, and was startled to hear how much he meant it. "Least of all that. I have had a surfeit of gratitude these 2 days. It is offered me at every turn, by everyone, for everything and for nothing, and it is never gratitude at all. It is a bill presented, with the sum left blank for me to fill. The turn of the dance parted them, brought them back. You are the first creature in this house who has looked at me as though I owed her nothing, and she wanted nothing, and I find I would rather be told I have made you trouble by you, than be thanked for the moon by any other soul here." She was quiet a moment, moving through the figure with a grave, unpracticed care, watching her own feet, and then, at the pause, watching him. "That is a strange thing to want," she said. "Most men in your place want the opposite. They want to be wanted very much. I wanted that once," he said. "I had it. I found out too late what it had been worth. That a man may be wanted from the crown of his head to the soles of his boots, and none of the wanting be for him at all, but only for the things he stands in front of. The way a beggar is fond of a lit window on a cold night and cares and has nothing for the family within." The figure carried her away and returned her. "You will say I ought to have known. I did not know. I was young enough to think that being loved and being useful were the same country. They are not. There is a border between them, and I did not find it until I had crossed it in the wrong direction and could not get back. Most men in my place have not learned what wanting costs, when it is the rank that is wanted and not the man." He had not meant to say that either. It came out of him plainly, without decoration, and he watched it reach her and saw her understand it, not with pity, which he could not have borne, but with a swift, quiet attention, as though he had handed her something and she had received it carefully and would not drop it. "I am sorry for it," she said simply. "Whoever taught you that lesson taught it cruelly." She did not ask who. She did not lean toward the wound the way the whole house would have leaned. She let it be, and turned in the figure, and said after a moment in a different voice, "You dance neither seldom nor badly, by the way." That was untrue. It was, he admitted. "I dance a great deal, and passably, and every measure of it." Then why say it? so that you would not stand alone. He said it before he could weigh it, and saw her step falter, the only falter she had made, and saw her recover it. You had answered them well, better than they deserved, better than I have heard anyone answer that sort in a great while. But answering costs, and I could see what it cost you, and I would not stand by the wall and watch it cost you and do nothing. I have done nothing, watching, rather too often in my life. I have grown tired of the taste of it. The music was drawing toward its close. He was aware, at the edges of his eye, of the whole room watching them and pretending not to, of Mrs. Quennell frozen by the wall with her fan halfway to her face, of Cornelia's bright ruined smile, of the Corliss girls' whispering heads. He was aware that every word he spoke to this girl was being counted and weighed, and would be currency in the county by morning. He found he could not make himself care for any of it. He cared only that the fiddlers were slowing, that the dance was ending, that in a moment he would have to give her hand back and let her be swallowed once more into the grey below-stairs country from which he had for 4 minutes stolen her. "You will not thank me," he said low, as the lost chord hung in the air. "I have forbidden it. But you might tell me one true thing before you go down, since no one in this house tells me true things and I have grown thirsty for them." She looked up at him. The candlelight was on her plain drawn hair and her tired, composed face, and her eyes met his gravely, without appeal. The way they had met his across the drawing-room the first night, asking nothing, offering nothing, and by that very withholding undoing him more thoroughly than all the arts of every practiced beauty in the room combined. "One true thing," she said. "Very well." She was silent a moment, choosing, and he waited on it as he had not waited on anything in 6 years. "I have not danced," she said at last, quietly only for him, "since my father was living. He taught me in the still room of an evening with no music but his own humming, because my stepmother would not have the master come to the house for me. I had thought I had forgotten how it felt. I had made myself forget because it was easier." Her chin lifted a very little. "That is my true thing, your grace. You have given me back a memory I had put away on purpose, and I do not yet know whether to thank you for it or not, and you have forbidden me to, so I shall not. There. You are answered." The music stopped, the floor stilled. He held her hand a half-second past the moment it should have been released, and let it go and bowed to her, and she curtsied a real curtsy, unhurried, without a shred of the servility they had tried to grind into her, and turned, and walked back through the parting, staring crowd toward the lower door, and the darkness beyond it, straight-backed, alone. Gerald stood where she had left him in the middle of the emptying floor, while the county surged and murmured all around him, and he understood. With the cold, clean certainty by which he knew the sound of a lie across a candle, that something in him had come unbolted that he would not now be able to lock again. He had spoken more truly to a stepmother's drudge in 4 minutes of a country dance than he had spoken to any living soul since he'd stood at a graveside and learned what his own heart was worth on the open market. And the terrible thing, the thing that held him rooted there long after the fiddlers had struck up the next set and Mrs. Quennell had come rustling toward him with her recovered smile and some smoothing lie ready upon her lips, the thing he could not get past, was that he did not want it to stop. He wanted the door to open again. He wanted her brought back into the light. He wanted, with an appetite that frightened him after 6 years of wanting nothing, only to keep on talking to the one person in England who had never once tried to make him. The music followed them only as far as the long window, and then the night took it and thinned it to nothing, and Gerald found himself standing on the terrace of Marrowfield with the daughter of the house beside him, and no lawful reason in the world to have brought her there. He had done it clumsily, for a man who was never clumsy. A word to her at the edge of the crush, a movement of his head toward the dark, an assumption that she would follow, which was insolent, and which she had answered by following, which unmade him more than any refusal could have done. Behind them the ballroom blazed. Out here there was only the cold breath of the box hedges and a moon laid thin as a coin over the fields she had once looked at across a wall. "You should go in," he said, and did not mean it, and knew that she heard he did not mean it. In a moment, Ottilie said, "They will not miss me. I am not a thing that is missed, your grace. I am a thing that is noticed only when I am where I ought not to be." She said it without bitterness, the way another woman might observe that it was likely to rain. and she drew her shawl closer over the grey gown that was 3 seasons out of fashion, and had been let out at the seam by a hand he suspected was her own. You should not have spoken to Miss Corliss as you did. She will not forgive it, and she will not forgive me for being the cause. She humiliated you before 40 people. She amused 40 people at my expense. It is a different thing and a cheaper one, and she is very good at it. Ottilie turned her face up to him, and in the moonlight it was not a plain face at all. It was only a quiet one, a face that had learned to give nothing away, because everything it had ever given away had been used against it. I have borne worse than a jest about my gloves. What I have not borne, and do not know how to bear, is a duke crossing a ballroom to stand between me and a laugh. You have made me visible. Do you know what you have done? You have made me a thing worth the trouble of destroying. It landed in him like a stone dropped down a deep well, the long fall, and then very far below, the strike. He had crossed the room without deciding to. He had heard Cornelia Corliss's clear-carrying voice make its pretty cut about a companion dressed above her station, had seen the grey figure absorb it the way a wall absorbs a thrown pebble, and he had been moving before he understood that he meant to move, and he had said the thing that silenced the room, and he had watched the daughter of the house go white with something that was not gratitude. Now he understood it had not been gratitude. It had been fear, and the fear was wiser than his chivalry. Then I have done you an injury, he said slowly, and I am not sorry, and that is the second time in a fortnight I have caught myself being not sorry for a thing I ought to regret. It is becoming a habit with me, Miss Quennell, and I do not care for habits. No, she agreed. You are a man who likes to know the shape of his own choosing. I saw that the first day, in the garden, when you stood at the wall and could not decide whether to be seen looking at me. He had thought himself unobserved. The discovery that he had not been, that the grey creature memorizing the fields had also, all the while, been memorizing him, moved through him warm and unwelcome as brandy. You saw a great deal for a woman who was sent from the room. Being sent from rooms is an education, Your Grace. One learns to see through the door before it closes. She smiled then, briefly, the first real smile he had had from her, and it was worth every tedium he had endured to reach this terrace. My stepmother believes she keeps me from society for my own protection. She has said so often, and I think a part of her even believes it. A girl with no fortune and no beauty, she says, is only wounded by being shown the things she cannot have. It is a kindness, she says. The smile went. It is not a kindness, but I have stopped correcting her. There is no arguing with a person who has decided to be generous to you. Your father, he began, is dead, she said. 6 years. He married again when I was 15, a widow with a daughter of her own, and a great deal of sense about money. And he was grateful to her, and he died grateful, and he left everything to be managed on my behalf until I should marry, which, as I am neither to be shown nor introduced nor spoken of, I am not likely to do. So it is managed. It has been managed very well. My cousin Alcina has 3 gowns from Paris, and I have this one, which was my mother's, cut down. She said the name Alcina without venom, which was somehow worse than venom. I am not telling you this to be pitied. I would ask you not to pity me. I have found it does more harm than a slight. I am telling you because you asked your man about me. Oh, servants talk, Your Grace, even yours, and I would rather you had the truth from me than a version of it polished for the county. The truth is very plain. I am a poor relation in my own father's house, and I have made my peace with it, and I was doing perfectly well at my peace until a duke crossed a ballroom. He was quiet a long time. The music behind them turned a corner into something slower, and a servant passed the far window with a branch of candles, throwing her profile for an instant into gold, and then letting it go back to silver. He had spent 10 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing that he had not first given himself leave to feel. He had built the whole architecture of himself around a single afternoon a decade gone. Around a woman named Celine who had smiled at him exactly as he wished to be smiled at and had meant, the whole while, a title and a settlement and a house in town. Around the discovery, made too late, and before too many witnesses, that he had been a fool in the one arena where he had believed himself unassailable. He had resolved that year, never again to be read so easily by a beautiful woman, and he had kept the resolution by the simple method of trusting no woman at all, and had made him feared, and feared had suited him. And now here was a woman who was not beautiful, who wanted nothing of him that he could discover, who had asked him not to be kind. "You are the first person in a decade," he said, "to tell me plainly not to do a thing, in the expectation that I might listen. And will you?" "No," he said. "I find I have no intention of it." He turned to her fully, and the cold and the dark and the thin coin of a moon all seemed to draw close about the two of them, shutting out the blazing careless room. "Walk with me, only to the end of the terrace and back. It is a small crime, and I will answer for it, and if your stepmother asks, I took you by the elbow and gave you no choice, which is nearly true." She looked at him for a moment that stretched, weighing him, he thought, with those grave eyes that missed nothing. And then she inclined her head and moved, and he walked beside her along the flags with the box hedges breathing at their shoulders, and he was aware, as he had not been aware of anything in years, of the exact distance between his sleeve and hers. She talked, when he asked her to, about small things, the garden she was permitted to keep because no one else wanted the labor of it, the herbs she dried, a lame pointer she had nursed that the household had meant to drown, the books she read by the last of the light, because candles were counted. She did not perform any of it. That was the thing that undid him, walking beside her in the dark. She did not turn a single hardship into a bid for his admiration, did not glance up to see how her courage was landing, once, arrange herself to be looked at. Cornelia Corliss could not cross a room without composing herself for the crossing. This woman had forgotten she was being looked at, or had never learned to expect it, and the forgetting was the loveliest thing he had ever watched. And the pointer, he said, the one they meant to drown. What became of it? He sleeps at the foot of my bed and is entirely useless, and I would not part with him for the world, she said, and there was more warmth in the words than in anything she had yet given him. My stepmother permits it because it is one less mouth she must pretend to grieve over. I feed him from my own plate. We understand one another, the pointer and I. We are both kept because it would look ill to be rid of us, and both of us know it, and neither of us complains, because complaint is the one luxury that is never, ever forgiven a dependent. She glanced up at him then, quick and sidelong. You are learning the whole ledger of me tonight, your grace. I hope it is worth a terrace to you. Most men would have found a livelier partner by the card tables. Most men, he said, have never had a woman refuse to charm them. I did not know until this hour how weary I was of being charmed. You are staring, your grace, she said without turning her head. I am. I beg your pardon. I have got out of the habit of things that do not want to be looked at, and I find I do not know the manners of it. Then I will teach you, she said. You look, and you say nothing of it, and you do not require the thing to arrange itself for your looking. That is the whole of the manners. It is what one does with a sunset, or a horse, or a good page of print. She stopped at the balustrade at the terrace's end, where the flags gave onto the dark drop of the ha-ha, and the fields ran silver away to the black line of the wood. There, she said softly. That is what I was memorizing across the wall, the day you could not decide whether to be seen. There is nothing more to it than that. I look at the fields because they are the one part of my father's estate no one has yet found a way to take from me, and I mean to have the whole of it by heart before they do. The wind lifted a loosened strand of her hair and laid it across her cheek, and without giving himself leave, without the architecture, without a decade of care, he raised his hand and moved it back. His knuckles grazed the cold of her cheek and the warmth beneath the cold. She went very still. She did not step back and she did not lean in. She only stood and looked at him and let him see that she felt it, which was braver than either retreat or advance, and the whole night narrowed to the half-inch of air his hand had just crossed. Miss Quennell, he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way he did not permit it. I came into this county to be bored for an afternoon. I know, she said. You told me so in effect the first day. You have a way of announcing your intentions to be indifferent. It is how I knew you were not. I do not know what to do with you. It was the plainest thing he had said to a living soul in 10 years. I have made a study of wanting nothing I cannot weigh. You cannot be weighed. You do not want my name, and you have said so, and I believe you, and I have not believed a woman in a decade, and here I stand believing you and unable to make it matter less. Then do not make it matter, Ottilie said very low. Let it be what it is, for one turn of a terrace. And then let me go back in before I am missed by the one person who would take a great deal of pleasure in missing me. But she did not move away as she said it, and her eyes did not leave his, and his hand was still against her cheek. And neither of them for a long moment did the sensible thing that both of them named. It was he who stepped back in the end, because he saw that if he did not she would not, and that the cost of it would fall on her and not on him, that a duke might be forgiven a moonlit terrace where a poor relation would be ruined by it. That single calculation, made for her sake and against his own wish, told him more about the state of his heart than any of the wanting had. He had spent 10 years unable to act except in his own defense. He had just for the first time since Selene acted in the defense of someone else, at cost to himself, and gladly. You are right, he said. Go in. I will follow at a distance and be seen to arrive from another quarter, and no one will have the pleasure of a story. He offered no touch this time. He had learned the manners of her already, but I mean to come back to Marrowfield, Miss Quennell. Not for the county. Not for Mrs. Quennell's card table. I will invent a reason your stepmother cannot refuse a duke, and I will come, and I will contrive to see you, and I give you fair warning of it so that you cannot say I stole a march. You are a great deal of trouble, she said, and the smile came back, and this time it stayed, and it changed her face entirely, and he understood he would remember it on his deathbed, for a man who came to be bored. She left him then, slipping along the shadow of the hedge toward the light, and he stood the balustrade above the silver fields and let his heart do the thing he had forbidden it for 10 years. He did not fight it. He was too old, suddenly, and too tired of the fight, and the fight had never yet made him happy, whereas one turn of a cold terrace had. He did not see the figure at the long window until it moved. When it moved, he knew it at once. The set of the shoulders, the poise composed for an audience even when the audience was only the dark. Cornelia Corliss stood in the lit frame of the window with a glass in her hand, and she was not looking at the fields, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at the point of shadow where the grey gown had just vanished into the light, and then she was looking at him, and she raised her glass a fraction, as one does to acknowledge a thing understood, and smiled, and turned away into the room. The cold that went through him then had nothing to do with the wind. He had made Ottilie Quennell visible. He had said as much, laughing at himself, an hour ago. She had said it to him, unlaughing, and he had chosen not to hear how much she meant it. He heard it now. He had crossed a ballroom, and a woman who forgot nothing and forgave less had watched him cross it, and had drawn from it precisely the conclusion he least wished her to draw, that the plain, hidden, penniless daughter of the house had done in one evening the thing every beauty in the county had failed to do in a decade, and had done it without appearing to try, which to a woman like Cornelia Corliss was not a triumph to be admired, but an offence to be answered. He stood a while longer, and the music played on behind the glass, and he understood that he had not, after all, done Ottilie an injury by making her visible. He had done something worse and more dangerous. He had made her a rival. And rivals, in Cornelia Corliss's careful accounting, were not laughed at across a supper table. They were removed. He went in at last, from another quarter as he had promised, and made his bow to Mrs. Quennell, and stood the requisite half-hour at the edge of the card-room being deferred. And all the while he watched the room for a grey gown and did not find it, because the daughter of the house had been sent, as she was always sent, early to bed. And he thought, with a coldness that was entirely new and entirely for her sake, whatever is coming, it is already begun, and I will not be quick enough unless I begin too. He had a fortnight, perhaps less. He had a decade of caution to unlearn in it. And he found, turning his glass in his hand beneath the blaze of Mrs. Quennell's chandeliers, that he had never in his guarded life wanted anything as plainly as he wanted to reach her before they did. The door did open again, in the days that followed, more often than either Prudence or the stepmother would have wished. It opened onto a walled garden at dusk, where the Duke of Kesbeck learned that Ottilie Quennell knew the names of every rose along the south wall, and had pruned half of them herself with hands that were meant, by rights of birth, to have held nothing rougher than a fan. It opened onto the still room, where she measured out physic for the tenants her stepmother would not trouble to visit, and where she told him, without one syllable of self-pity, which was the thing that undid him past mending, how her father's fortune had gone to his widow entire, and how a daughter of the first marriage was a debt to be housed and hidden and never, on any account, brought forward where the world might ask whose child she was. He had stood among the drying lavender and listened, and had understood that everything he had been taught to distrust in a woman, appetite, calculation, the practised angling after his name, was precisely everything this one did not possess, and the wound he had carried 6 years, since a bright and beautiful creature had wept at his proposal and confided to another man that she wept only for the coronet, had begun, against all his hard-won caution, to knit. So it was that when the summons came that morning to the great drawing-room, and he entered to find the whole county already assembled in a hush that had teeth in it, Gerald felt the first cold prickle of a man who has let himself grow warm, and is about to be reminded why he had chosen the cold. They were ranged about the room as if for a tableau, Mrs. Quennell in claret silk near the hearth, her handkerchief pressed to a mouth that trembled with what a stranger might have taken for grief, Cornelia Corliss beside her, upright and lovely and grave, her hands folded at her waist in the attitude of a woman who has been forced, most reluctantly, into an unpleasant duty. 20 others stood about in a loose ring, fans stilled, eyes bright with the particular hunger of the well-bred for a fall, and in the centre of the ring, alone, stood Ottilie, in her grey stuff gown, her chin level, her hands quiet at her sides, and on the small table before her, laid out upon a square of white linen as though upon a bier, glittered a rope of diamonds and sapphires that Gerald had last seen about Cornelia Corliss's throat at the ball. "Your Grace," Mrs. Quennell came toward him, and her voice shook with beautiful precision. "Forgive us. We would not for the world have troubled you with a domestic wretchedness, but the thing touches the honour of your friends, and it could not be kept from you. Miss Corliss's necklace, which her late mother wore to be presented, has been these 3 days missing. She let the handkerchief fall from her lips. It was found this morning." "It was found," she said, and turned, and her plump white hand rose and pointed, steady as a musket, wrapped in a stocking, in the box beneath that girl's bed. The word girl she used as one uses a stick. The ring of faces turned as one to Ottilie. Gerald turned with them, and for the length of a single heartbeat, one only, but he would despise himself for it long after. The old poison moved in his blood faster than his reason could. He had trusted once. He had stood before the county exactly so, radiant with certainty, and had been shown himself for a fool who mistook a huntress for a hart. And here again was the ring, and the whisper, and a woman he had let inside his guard standing accused in the middle of it, and something craven and scarred in him flinched back and thought coldly, so it was that after all, and was almost grateful for the escape. He had time, in that one heartbeat, to feel how neatly the trap was sprung. It required nothing of him but his own history. It asked only that the Duke of Kesbeck do what the Duke of Kesbeck had done for 6 years without fail. Believe the worst, close the gate, walk away untouched. And it dressed that cowardice up as wisdom and handed it to him as a kindness. Miss Corliss had built him a door marked escape and stood aside most graciously for him to take it. And the scarred thing in him leaned toward that door with a longing very like relief, because behind it lay the old safe cold he understood, and on this side of it lay a walled garden and a still room and a woman who had made him want things again, and wanting had only ever cost him. Then he looked at her face. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the necklace and then at her stepmother, and there was in her grey eyes no guilt and no terror, and most tellingly of all, no surprise, only a still, exhausted recognition. The look of one who has waited a long while for a blow she always knew was coming, and is almost eased that it has fallen at last. It was not the look of a thief discovered. It was the look of a prisoner hearing at last the sentence she had been told from childhood was already written. "Well, girl," said Mrs. Quennell, "have you nothing to say? His Grace is waiting. We are all of us waiting." Cornelia Corliss spoke then, gently, sorrowfully, in the low clear voice that carried to every corner. I begged them to say nothing. She lifted her lovely troubled eyes to the Duke. I said, whatever she has done, she is unfortunate. Let it be hushed. Let her go quietly. But there is worse, your grace, and it is that worse which forced my hand, for it touches you. A small, exquisite hesitation, the theft I could have forgiven. But I have letters, I have them here, in her own hand, to a cousin in town, laid open by chance. She writes that she means to have you, that a moment's notice from the Duke of Kesbeck is worth more than a lifetime of drudgery, and that a clever girl who is thrown once in his way need only play the wounded innocent, the honest poor thing who wants nothing, and the coldest man in England will do the rest and never feel the hook. Cornelia's voice broke on a note of pure sorrow. She wrote that, your grace. I could not let you be made a fool of, not you, not again, not again. The two words landed in him like a hook indeed. So they knew. Of course they knew, the whole county knew. It was the one story about him that had outlived every other, and Cornelia had reached with a jeweller's precision straight into the 6-year-old wound and turned the blade. The wounded innocent, the honest poor thing who wants nothing. Was that not exactly what had drawn him? Was that not the very quality he had prized in her above every diamond in the room? That she wanted nothing, asked nothing, flattered nothing, and if it were a study, a part performed for his benefit by a clever girl who had been thrown once in his way. His face gave nothing. 6 years of the cold had taught it that much, but within for one more ruinous moment the Duke of Kesbeck wavered, and hated that he wavered, and could not stop. The letters, he said. His voice came out level and terrible, the voice that had ended men's ambitions across a card table. Let me see them. Cornelia produced them from her reticule. 2 folded sheets, a little worn at the creases as though much handled. She crossed and laid them in his hand with her eyes cast down. He unfolded the first. The hand was small, upright, careful. A poor woman's hand, ink eked out, the paper turned and written crosswise to save it. My dear cousin. He read the salutation and the first lines, and there indeed were the words, near enough, a notice from the Duke of Kesbeck. Worth more than a lifetime, the wounded innocent. And the cold-reasoned cruelty of the thing was so unlike every true word she had ever spoken to him among the lavender and the roses that the very perfection of the case, slowly, to ring false in his practised ear. The way a lie rings false across a candle, he read on, and the further he read, the louder the wrong note sounded, for the letter was too apt. It answered every doubt a suspicious man could hold, and it answered them in order, and it used. He saw it now with the cold clarity that had made him feared at every table in the kingdom. It used his own words, the wounded innocent. He had never spoken that phrase aloud but to himself. In the dark, 6 years ago and 1,000 times since, and yet here it stood, penned by a poor girl to a cousin who did not exist, as though the writer had reached into the Duke's private history and lifted out the very shape of his old betrayal to press it against this new one. A woman planning a seduction does not trouble to script the seducer's inmost scar. A woman framing another woman for a jealous friend does exactly that. These are much handled, he said aloud, turning the second sheet to the light. For letters said been come upon by chance 3 days since, Miss Corliss, they have the look of paper carried a good while in a warm hand and conned by heart. And the crease here has been folded and refolded. See, as one folds a thing one is rehearsing. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. It is a small point. I am fond of small points. They are generally the only honest things in a room. A flush went up Cornelia Corliss's white throat, there and gone, and she recovered her sorrowing composure so swiftly that half the room never marked it. But Gerald marked it. He marked it the way he had once, across a candle, marked the flicker that had told him the truth of his own ruin too late to save his heart. He was not too late now. He held the moment in his hand like a card he had not yet decided to play. He looked up from the letters to the woman who was said to have written them. Miss Quennell, he said, you have heard the charge. Both charges. Will you answer them? For the first time she looked at him, and he braced for the appeal, for the trembling lip, the outstretched hand, the tears that would have been so natural and so damning. None came. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across the drawing-room the first night, gravely asking nothing, offering nothing, and by that very withholding she pulled the ground back under his feet. I did not take the necklace, your grace, she said. Her voice was low and perfectly steady. I have never in my life touched it. As to how it came to be beneath my bed, I will not accuse anyone, for I have no proof, and a woman in my place who accuses is only thought insolent as well as thieving, a faint, weary something that was not quite a smile, and I did not write those letters. I have no cousin in town, I have no cousin anywhere. My father's people are dead and my mother's would not own me. She paused. But I understand that my saying so weighs nothing against a paper in a lady's hand and a jewel found in my box. I have understood that for a great many years, that my word is the lightest thing in any room I am permitted to enter, so I will not waste your morning protesting it. You see, murmured Mrs. Quennell to the room with a sorrowing shake of her head, not even a denial worth the name. The brazenness of it. I have made my denial, madam, said Ottilie, and though she did not raise her voice either, it reached the far wall. You would only have me make it louder, so that you might call me shrill as well as false. I have lived 19 years under your roof, and I have learned the whole of the lesson you set out to teach me, that there is no pitch at which a poor woman may speak and be believed over a rich one. So I shall not oblige you by shrieking my innocence to a room that has already sold it. If I am to be a thief this morning, I had rather be a quiet one. She turned her grave grey eyes for a moment upon Cornelia Corliss, and only upon her. The necklace is very fine, Miss Corliss. I hope, when you have it back about your throat tonight, that it sits easy there. The words were soft as falling snow, and they landed like a slap. A ripple went through the ring. Somewhere a fan stopped dead. Cornelia's chin came up, and for a heartbeat the sorrow slipped clean off her lovely face and something naked and ugly looked out from under it, and Gerald saw that too, and filed it with the flush and the worn creases and the borrowed private phrase, another small honest thing in a room full of large lies. She denied both, said the Duke, without turning his head. Something in the flat quiet of it stopped the stepmother's mouth. But he did not move to Ottilie's side, and he felt the whole room register that he did not, and he felt Tilly register it too, though she gave no sign, and the wound in him, the coward in him, held him where he stood, one pace too far from her, weighing, unable in that poisoned moment to lay down 6 years and simply choose. And she saw it. That was the thing he would carry longest out of that morning, that she saw him weigh her, saw the hesitation he thought his face concealed, and did not reproach him for so much as a flicker. She only lowered her eyes and gave a very small nod, as one accepts a thing long expected, and he understood that she had just watched the last door in the world close, and had decided not to beat upon it. Then it is settled, said Cornelia Corliss softly into his silence, and the softness was the softness of a foot set upon a throat. Your Grace, I am so sorry. I would have spared you. Send for the constable, said Mrs. Quennell. And now the tremble was gone from her voice, and only the relish remained, the long-nursed triumph of a woman who has at last, before all the county and the greatest man in it, been handed leave to be rid of the girl whose face was too much her dead husband's, and whose dignity had always been a standing reproach. She'll not sleep another night under this roof. Theft from a guest, and slander of a duke. She'll go to the assizes for the one and be turned off without a character for the other. And God knows what becomes of such creatures then, and it is no longer my affair. I have housed her out of Christian duty a great deal longer than any woman ought. Marjorie, fetch her bonnet and her box. She may wait in the scullery for the cart. A murmur went round the ring, low and satisfied and dreadful, the sound of a comfortable world closing ranks against the one who had presumed to stand up in it. Fans began, discreetly, to stir again. It was, to every soul in that drawing-room save two, a matter concluded, an unpleasantness handsomely resolved, the natural order restored. The pretty poor upstart who had actually danced with the Duke of Kesbeck actually held the eye of the county for 4 whole minutes. Put back at last where such creatures belonged, beneath a bed and behind a scullery door and out of sight, Ottilie Quennell bent, and with her own hands folded the square of white linen back over the diamonds, neatly, so that they should not be scratched, a servant's reflex. Tending a thing that had been used to damn her, and then she straightened, and drew the grey shawl closer about her shoulders, and stood waiting to be taken away with a composure that no one in the room had earned the right to witness. She did not look again at the Duke. She had asked him for nothing at the beginning, and she would ask him for nothing at the end, and it was that, precisely that, the flint-straight refusal to plead even now with her whole life going down, that at last cut clean through 6 years of scar tissue and told Gerald, too late. What a fool he had come within one heartbeat of being, but the heartbeat had passed and he had not spoken, and now the room was moving. The maid Marjorie had gone for the box. Cornelia was murmuring consolation into his sleeve. Mrs. Quennell was already turning to a neighbour to lament, prettily, the ingratitude of the low. The tableau was breaking up into the small triumphant motions of a scandal enjoyed and finished, and Ottilie was being drawn back toward the lower door, and the scullery and the cart. Swallowed once more into the grey below-stairs country from which he had stolen her for 4 minutes, and to which they were now returning her forever, straight-backed, dry-eyed, alone, and the Duke of Kestbeck stood a pace too far off in the middle of the ring. The false letters still open in his hand, the ink already ringing false in his ear, the truth of her rising in him like a tide against the old cold fear, and the cruel had, to all the world and to the woman herself, plainly and comprehensively won. The pearls lay in a little heap of stolen milk-light upon the silver salver, where Cornelia Corliss had let them fall for the whole room to see, and Gerald, standing 3 paces off with his glass forgotten in his hand, understood that he was watching a woman be destroyed with the tools of good manners. It was very quietly done. There was no shouting. There was only Cornelia, pale and composed and trembling in the way that a practised person trembles when she wishes trembling to be observed, and Mrs. Balfour Quennell at her shoulder with her hand pressed to her bosom and her eyes already bright with a grief she had not troubled to make convincing. And Sir Anthony Corliss, coming forward through the parting company, with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who is a magistrate in his own county, and means everyone to remember it, and in the centre of them, where a moment ago there had been a supper and 100 candles and the ordinary glittering cruelty of the county at its pleasure, stood Ottilie in her grey gown, with her work-basket open at her feet and the scrap of knotted linen that had held the pearls lying beside it. Accused of theft before every soul who mattered for 15 miles, and saying nothing, because there was nothing that saying would mend, and for the space of one breath, one only, but he would be ashamed of it to the end of his days. Gerald felt the old cold thing lift its head in him. It came as it always came, without invitation, in Celine's voice, in the graveside voice of a decade ago that had taught him what a beautiful woman's tenderness was worth. They deceive, all of them, and the plainer the face, the deeper the wanting. And you have been made a fool once before a laughing company and are being made one again, and the grey girl too has a hidden face, and you saw only what you wished to see. For one breath he looked at the pearls and at the downcast girl, and felt the whole architecture of 10 guarded years lean toward the easy, bitter, self-protecting conclusion, because it was so much less painful to be betrayed by her than to watch her ruined and be too slow to stop it. Then Ottilie lifted her head. She did not look at Cornelia, nor at the magistrate, nor at the room. She looked across it, once at him gravely, without appeal, asking nothing, as she had looked at him across the drawing-room the first night. And in that look there was no plea and no craft and no fear that begged to be soothed, only a person meeting whatever was coming without the luxury of complaint, and the breath went out of him and took the old cold thing with it. And he was ashamed to the marrow that he had entertained it even so long as a breath. She had not stolen anything. He knew it the way he knew the sound of a lie across a candle. He had known it before he had let himself doubt it, and he had doubted it only because doubting cost him less, and he set the cost down now and picked up the harder thing, which was to be right and to be quick, both at once, before Sir Anthony Corliss closed his hand upon her. "You will forgive me," said the Duke of Kestbeck, and his voice, level and unhurried, dropped into the brittle silence like a coin onto marble, so that every head turned. "I have arrived at the entertainment rather too late for the beginning of the story. Let someone tell it me from the top. Who saw the theft?" There was a small pause, of the kind that opens beneath a question no one has thought to ask. "The pearls are mine, your grace," said Cornelia, recovering, turning to him the tragic and trembling face that had never in her life failed to move a man. "My own from my throat, laid in my dressing-case not 2 hours since, and they were found, I can scarcely say it, they were found in a basket, in the mending, wrapped so hidden so." Her voice broke very prettily. "I did not wish to believe it. I begged them not to look, but there they were." There they were, Gerald agreed, in her basket. And who looked? I looked, said the elder Miss Corliss, emboldened from the safety of her sister's side. We all of us saw the basket brought in. You saw the basket brought in, he said. You did not see the pearls put into it. They were in it, snapped Mrs. Quennell, her patience fraying ahead of her performance, which is the whole of the matter, your grace, however you turn it about. A valuable thing gone from one room and found in the property of a girl, who has the run of the still room and the passages, and every dark corner of this house, a girl of no portion, and no prospects, who has every reason on earth to hang herself, said Gerald, for a rope of pearls she could never sell in this county without being taken up within the hour, and could not sell out of it without a coach and a road and money for the road, none of which she possesses. You describe a very stupid thief, madam. I have been in this young woman's company on several occasions, and stupidity is not among the things I have found in her. He let that sit and turned mild as milk upon Cornelia. You said the pearls were wrapped, hidden so. You have told us how they lay before the basket was opened. How did you know how they lay? The room did not understand it yet. He watched the words go into Cornelia and watched the exact instant she felt where they'd gone, the small stumble behind the tragic eyes, and he pressed the advantage before she could shore it up. You said hidden so, and made the shape of it with your hands, wrapped in a scrap of linen and knotted, and pushed down beneath the spools of thread. You said it before Sir Anthony had lifted the lid. I was watching the basket, Miss Corliss, not your face, a habit of mine to watch the thing and not the performance. And the lid was down and your hands were describing to us all precisely what was underneath it. Now, a woman may know where a thing is hidden because she found it there, or because she put it there. There is no third way that I have ever heard of, in a long life among liars. Which was yours? Cornelia's colour, which had been so carefully absent, came up now in two hard betraying spots high on her cheeks, the very spots he had seen rise at the ball when Ottilie's quiet answer had landed. I heard the servant say, I was told where it was found. By whom? Name the servant. Sir Anthony will send for her directly, and she will tell us whether she described the knot to you or whether you described it to her. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to raise his voice, and he did not begin now. He only stood in the centre of the room with the whole cold weight of his rank and his certainty, and let the silence do the work that shouting could not. Name the servant, Miss Corliss. She could not. He saw her cast about for the name and find none, because there was none, because no servant had told her anything, because the knot was her own, and the knowing was her own, and the pearls had left her throat by her own hand and travelled to the mending basket by her own hand. And the whole beautiful engine of it had turned upon the one small vanity she had not been able to resist, the vanity of being seen to grieve, of describing her own wound too well. And it was then, into that widening silence, that Gerald did the thing he had learned on a cold terrace, which was to look at what was truly there and not at what wished to be seen. Bring me the basket, he said. A footman, white-faced, brought it. He did not touch Ottilie's work. He only lifted on one finger the scrap of knotted linen that had held the pearls, and held it up to the candles for the room. Here is a knot, he said, a common, clumsy granny's knot, tied in a hurry by a hand that does not much care for its own work. And here, he turned and looked at Ottilie, and his voice gentled without his meaning it to, here is the cuff of this young woman's gown, which she mended, I should think, by the last of a counted candle, because I have been told she is not permitted many. Look at the stitches in it. I marked them the first night I was ever in her presence, before I knew her name, and I have not forgotten them, because they were the finest small work I had seen since my mother's day. 9 stitches to the inch, and every one of them invisible. That is her hand. That, the finger with the clumsy scrap, is not. Whoever wrapped these pearls to hide them in her basket had never in her life taken the trouble to sew a thing well, because she has never once had to. You will find her hand in that knot. You will not find it in that cuff. They are 2 different women, and only one of them is standing accused. Somewhere at the back of the room a matron said, Lo, it is true, I have had the child's mending. There is no neater needle in the parish, and another voice took it up, and a third. for half the good women present had at one time or another sent their torn linen quietly to the grey girl at Marrowfield and paid her in coppers and told no one. And now the murmur that had run so gaily at Ottilie's expense an hour ago turned, and began subtly and altogether to run the other way. He felt the whole temper of the room shift under him like a tide going out, and he pressed his advantage the way a man presses a horse at the one moment the fence will let him over, before the fear can gather again. Moreover, said Gerald, before the turning could lose its force, I am told the theft was contrived not 2 hours since. 2 hours since Miss Quennell was at the gate lodge, at the far end of the drive, sitting up with the gatekeeper's boy, who has had a fever this fortnight and whom no one else in this house could be troubled to nurse. She carried him broth from the still room and sat with him while the rest of you danced. The gatekeeper will swear to it. His wife will swear to it. The boy himself, God willing, will live to swear to it. She was half a mile from Miss Corliss's dressing case with a sick child's head in her lap while the pearls were being spirited into her basket by someone who knew the house had a convenient drudge to hang them upon. That is, Mrs. Quennell had gone quite grey. That is a slander, your grace, a monstrous. Send to the lodge, said Sir Anthony Corliss heavily. They were all of them his own kin. Cornelia was his niece, or near enough. The pride of the family was his pride, but he was also Gerald Saw, a magistrate who had just been shown a knot and a cuff and a room full of witnesses whose faces had turned, and who did not intend to be the man who committed a duke's plain favourite to the assizes on his niece's tail, and be laughed out of the county for it after. Send to the lodge, he said again, and one of his own grooms was sent, and the room stood in a horrible ringing silence to wait, and did not have to wait long, for the gatekeeper had followed the commotion up the drive already, and stood even now in the passage doorway twisting his hat. And when they put the question to him, he answered it plainly, that Miss Ottilie had been with his lad from the striking of 8 until they came running to fetch her not 10 minutes gone, and that his wife had been in and out the whole while, and that he'd stake his place on it, aye, and his soul after, and that was the end of Cornelia Corliss. She knew it before the others did. He watched the knowledge come into her and watched her make in her ruin the single choice that damned her past any mending, which was to reach not for dignity but for spite. She has bewitched him, Cornelia cried, flinging out her hand at Ottilie, her lovely face contorting into something the candlelight had never yet shown the county. Look at him defend a kitchen drab, a nothing, a servant in mended wool. She has thrown herself at a duke, and he is besotted and blind, and you all stand and let a scullery slut make fools of your betters. And she said a great deal more in that vein, faster and higher and uglier, and every word of it undid her further, because it was the plain truth of her own heart come screaming out at last, the jealousy and the spite and the cold contriving malice, all of it stripped of the pretty trembling and laid bare on the salver, beside the pearls for the whole county to look at. Her mother caught at her arm. She shook it off. The elder Miss Corliss had gone very quiet and was edging, in the manner of her kind, toward the far side of the room and the safety of not having been the one who spoke. And the company that had come to see the grey girl broken looked instead upon the beauty in the year's rent of a gown shrieking accusations of witchcraft in the middle of a supper, and drew back from her, one and all, with the particular distaste of people who have been made accessory to a cruelty and wish very much to be thought to have had no part in it. I think, said Sir Anthony Corliss into the wreckage, in the voice of a magistrate who has decided which way the wind now sets, that there has been no theft here tonight. A pearl necklace has been mislaid and recovered. Nothing more will be said of it. He looked at his niece, and something in his heavy face was almost pity and mostly disgust. Cornelia, you will go up, now. She went in the end, because there was nothing else on earth to do, dragged half by her mother and half by her own broken pride. And the door closed on her, and the sound of her weeping went up the stairs and grew faint and was gone, and the county let out its breath in a long low murmur that had in it not one grain of sympathy, and turned as one to look at the girl in grey they had all despised an hour ago and now found themselves uncomfortably unable to meet in the eye. Gerald turned to her. That was all he wanted now, in the whole ringing aftermath of it, to turn to her, to cross the small space of floor To take her hand where it hung at her side, and say the thing that had been building in him since a cold terrace and a strand of hair, that he had come within one shameful breath of doubting her, and would spend the rest of his life making it right. That he did not care who watched him cross the floor, that he wanted her, plainly, and had never in his guarded life wanted anything so plainly. But she was not there. He had taken his eyes from her for length of Cornelia's ruin, a moment, no more, and in that moment Ottilie Quennell had done the thing that no one in that room had thought her capable of, and that he, of all of them, should have known she would do. She had not stayed to be vindicated. She had not waited by the wall to be pitied, or thanked, or looked at with the sudden shamed kindness of people who had wronged her, and wished now to be forgiven cheaply for it. She had picked up her work-basket, and closed the lid on the neat invisible stitching that had saved her, and slipped out through the lower door into the dark passage and the servants' country beyond it, straight-backed and alone, as she had walked out of every room in that house since she was a child, expecting nothing, asking nothing, taking her dignity with her, because it was the one possession they had never found a way to steal. The lower door stood a hand's breadth open on the blackness. He did not make his bow. He did not make his excuses to Mrs. Balfour Quennell, standing stricken and ruined by the cold hearth of her own contriving, nor to Sir Anthony, nor to the whispering, staring, chastened county. He set his glass down blind upon the nearest surface, and he crossed the room, not with the still slow tread that passed for hauteur, but quickly, openly, in front of them all, so that they should see exactly where the Duke of Kest bent and after whom, and he pulled the lower door wide and went through it into the dark, into the cold stone passage that smelled of tallow and lye, calling her name for the first time in his life aloud, Ottilie, Ottilie, wait, with no thought at all for who heard him call it, because he had come so near, so shamefully near, to losing the one true heart the world had ever offered him, and he did not mean to lose it now to her pride and his own slowness by so much as another minute of the dark. He crossed the ring. There was no grace in it and no ducal composure. There was only a man moving faster than the room could follow, the false letters crushed now in one fist and his own hand out toward her as though she were going down into water and not merely toward a scullery door. The murmur had not yet finished changing its shape. A moment before it had been the low satisfied hum of a scandal comfortably concluded. Then Baldington's steady old voice had cut across it with the truth of the ink and the truth of the hand that forged it. And the county's manservant had held up the second letter beside the first for any who cared to look, and the hum had cracked and turned, and begun to round upon the two women at its centre like a tide remembering which way it was meant to run, but Gerald heard none of it. He heard only that Ottilie had reached the lower door, and had put her hand upon it to go, and that no one had yet told her she need not. Miss Quennell. She stopped. She did not turn at once, and he understood why. She had schooled herself, in the long grey minutes of her ruin, to expect nothing further from him, and a voice was only a voice, and might be pity which she would not take. So he said her name again, and this time he was near enough that when she did turn he was already there, close, near enough to see that her composure had cost her everything, and that the eyes she lifted to him were dry by an act of will he would remember to the end of his life. "You have somewhere better to be than the scullery," he said, "for her and not for them, and I have been 6 years too great a coward to say so. Do not go through that door. Your Grace," her voice was quiet and level, and it did not thank him, "the letters are shown false. That is enough. You need not stand up before your friends for a servant's honour. I would not have you pay so dear for a kindness. Let me go quietly. It is easier for everyone, and I am a breath. I am well used to the easier thing." "I am not," said the Duke, and he turned, still holding her hand now. He had taken it without leave, her cold servant's hand with the reddened knuckles, and he did not give it back. He turned so that they stood together facing the whole bright, cruel ring of them, and he lifted his voice at last to the pitch that had silenced the House of Lords and cowed magistrates, and made the Duke of Kesbeck a name mothers used to frighten ambitious daughters. "You will attend me," he said, "all of you, for I mean to say this once, and I mean it to be carried home in every carriage in this county tonight." The fans stopped. Cornelia Corliss had gone the colour of tallow. Mrs. Quennell, halfway through a lament to a neighbour, closed her mouth upon it. "These letters," said Gerald, and let the crushed papers fall open and flutter to the floor between them all, "were written to damn her, and were written by a hand in this room, and every soul who was so eager to believe them a quarter hour since will now be so good as to remember, for the rest of their lives, how quickly they were pleased to believe them. You believed her a thief because she was poor. You believed her a liar because she was quiet. You watched a woman fold a stranger's diamonds back into their linen with her own hands so they should not be scratched. While you sent for the constable to take her, and not one of you, not one, thought that a guilty creature does not tend the very jewels got up to hang her." His voice did not rise further. It dropped, which was worse. "I thought it. I stood a pace off and I thought it, and I said nothing, because I have spent 6 years teaching myself that no woman who looks kindly on me looks kindly on the man, and so I very nearly let you do it. That is my share, and I will carry it. But I will not carry the rest of you a step further." He looked down at her then, and the whole hard public voice went out of him at once, the way a fire is a fire until the moment it is only warmth. 6 years ago, he said, and now he said it to her, though they all heard. "A woman I meant to marry emptied my father's house of everything her love had promised me, and left me the title she had actually wanted. I was young enough to think that was the last time I should ever be a fool. I made myself feared so that I need never again be deceived, and I called it wisdom, and it was only fear wearing better clothes. And then you would not flatter me. You would not perform for me. You told me, in your stepmother's garden, that a great name was a poor thing to be loved for and a worse thing to hide behind, and you did not know, you cannot have known, that you had put your finger on the exact door I had been leaning my whole weight against for 6 years to keep shut." His mouth moved not quite a smile. "You undid me, Ottilie Quennell. You have been undoing me since the night I saw you carry your own shame up off the floor of a ballroom straighter than any duchess in it. I have been the most reluctant man in England about it. I am reluctant no longer." The room made no sound at all. "I am asking you to be my wife," said the Duke of Kesbeck, before them, "because you have never once asked me for anything, and I find I cannot bear to be the last person in this county to give you your due. But hear me," and here his hand tightened on hers, urgent, almost afraid. "Hear me, for this is the whole of it. I am not offering you a rescue. If you take a rescue you will always wonder whether you took it because the cart was at the door. And I will not have that doubt in the house with us for 40 years. Refuse me the rank. Refuse me the rescue. There is the door. Walk through it a free woman with nothing, and I will send my own carriage after you to any cottage in the kingdom and court unit on my knees like a curate, and you may have me or not as you find the man worth having. I want only the one thing you have never given anyone leave to give you. I want to be chosen. Choose me or do not, but choose the man and never the Duke." For a long moment Ottilie only looked at him, and Gerald, who had faced ruin at cards and enemies in the Lords and a father's contempt without a flicker, found that his heart was going like a boy's. "You are a very foolish man," she said at last softly, and there was water in her eyes now, come at the kindness where it had never come at the cruelty. "To offer a woman a cottage and a curate when you have a dukedom in your pocket. I am told it is my chief fault," he said. "It is not. A breath of a laugh unsteady. Your chief fault, your grace, is that you stood a pace too far off for a quarter of an hour, and I forgive it, because you have crossed the floor now, and I watched you do it, and no one made you." Her fingers turned slowly within his and closed. Not clung, closed, sure and deliberate choosing. "I do not want the rank. I never wanted the rank. God knows it has brought me nothing but a stepmother's spite for the little I stood too near it. But the man who would offer to lose it from me," her voice steadied and rang clear enough for the farthest fan, "that man I will have. Yes, I choose you, Gerald, the man, and I would have chosen him in the scullery." He did not kiss her. There were 40 pairs of eyes, and she had been shamed enough in that room for one lifetime, and he would not spend her dignity even in joy. He raised her closed hand instead and pressed his mouth to the reddened knuckles, slow, deliberate, before the whole staring county. The Duke of Kesbeck bowing over a servant's chapped hand as over a queen's, and the gesture went round the room like a struck bell, and did more to raise Ottilie Quennell above every powdered woman present than any coronet could have done. Then he straightened, and remembered the rest of them, and the warmth in his face cooled by several degrees. Mrs. Quennell, the stepmother, had shrunk against the mantel. Her triumph curdled on her face into something old and afraid. "Your Grace, I am sure I never. The girl was always dear to me, my own husband's child. I housed her these many years out of Christian duty," said the Duke. "Yes, I heard you. You housed your husband's daughter beneath a bed and behind a scullery door, and you called it charity, and tonight you sent for a constable to take her to the assizes on a lie, and I heard that too. You will not be prosecuted for it." He let that sit until the relief began to dawn on her face, and then he took it away. "You will not be prosecuted because Miss Quennell will ask me to spare you, for she is a better creature than you have ever troubled to notice, and I will do it to please her and not to please you. But you will understand what you are. Every door in this county that has ever opened to you opened because you kept a duke's future duchess sweeping your grates. Those doors will remember it. I shall see that they do." He turned his head a fraction. "The girl Marjorie, the maid, she is dismissed from your service as of this hour. She goes to mine at 3 times your wage, for she once carried Miss Quennell a candle when you had ordered her to sit in the dark, and I do not forget such things even when they are done for others. Send her box to Kesbeck." Mrs. Quennell's mouth worked. No sound came out of it that was worth the room's attention, and no one gave it any. "As for you," said Gerald, and now he looked at Cornelia Corliss, who had not moved, who stood in the middle of the ring with the ruin of her own cleverness scattered in ink across the floor at her feet. He looked at her for a long time, and it was not anger in his face. It was something she plainly found far harder to bear, a kind of weary, final measuring, the look a man gives a sum he has finished with. "You wrote the letters. You bought the maid who hid the diamonds." "No, do not. I have the girl's account and Baldington has the paper, and there is nothing left in you clever enough to talk your way over both. You did it because I danced with her and not with you, and you would rather have seen her transported than see me look twice at a woman with no fortune to make the match respectable." He shook his head slowly. "You have spent 5 seasons teaching this county that you were the most desirable thing in it. You have taught it something else tonight, and it will not unlearn it. I will bring no charge. The charge would touch her name, and I will not have Ottilie's wedding spoken of in the same breath as an assize court. But you will leave, not the house, the county, before the month is out. You will find, I think, that the invitations have already stopped." And they had. He could see it happening even as he spoke, in the small stiff turnings away all round the ring. The fans lifted now to shut her out where a half-hour before they had fluttered so companionably at Ottilie's expense. The comfortable world he had described closing ranks again. But the other way this time, against the beauty who had overreached and not the servant who had endured. Cornelia Corliss walked out of that drawing-room alone, and no one moved to go with her, and it was, Gerald thought, a more complete undoing than any court could have handed down, for she had lived by the county's love, and the county has a long memory for the day it is made to feel a fool. Then the doors were shut behind the last of them, and the great bright room was suddenly only a room, over-warm, littered with dropped fans and scattered false letters, and the diamonds still folded in their square of linen on the floor where a poor girl's careful hands had left them. And the Duke of Kesbeck stood in the middle of it with the one heart in 3 counties he had almost thrown away, and found that his own knees were none too steady. "You are trembling," Ottilie said, wondering. "I came within 1 heartbeat of it," he said simply. "Of standing a pace off and letting the cart take you. I shall be trembling at a heartbeat for some years, I think. You will have to be patient with a man who was very nearly the greatest fool in England and knows it to the hour." She lifted her free hand, the servant's reflex still in her, to tend, to smooth, to set right, and laid it against the side of his face, and he turned his cheek into that reddened, work-roughened palm as though it were the softest thing he had ever been given, which he was coming to understand it was. "You were a pace off for a quarter of an hour," she said. "You have been at my side ever since. I find I'm not disposed to count the quarter hour against a lifetime. Only, Gerald," her thumb moved once against his cheekbone, "do not make me a duchess to spite them. I could not bear to be a coronet you set upon the mantel to make Cornelia Corliss weep. Make me your wife because you cannot eat your breakfast without me across the table, and let the county make of it what it will. I cannot eat my breakfast without you across the table, he said gravely, and I have never once eaten it with you, which tells you how far gone I am. Come, there is nothing here worth another minute of you. He bent, and with his own 2 hands, a duke's hands that had never in their life picked a fallen thing up off a floor, he gathered the diamonds in their linen and set them upon the mantel for their owner to reclaim, because Ottilie had glanced at them, and he found already that a glance from her moved him more surely than any command he had obeyed in his life. Then he drew her arm through his, and settled her grey shawl closer about her shoulders with a care that made the last few lingering servants at the doors turn their faces away to hide what was in them, and he walked her out of her stepmother's house through the great front door, the wide one, the one she had been forbidden for 6 years to so much as answer. His carriage stood at the foot of the steps in the blue dark, the lamps lit, the horses steaming. He handed her up into it himself, and got in after her, and did not sit across from her as a duke ought, but beside her, close, so that when the wheels began to turn and the hidden house with all its cruelty slid away behind them into the night for the last time, she could lean her head against his shoulder, and he could rest his cheek upon her hair, and neither of them need say anything at all. They were married that autumn from Kestbeck, and the whole county came, for the whole county had discovered, overnight, that it had always known Miss Quennell to be a young woman of the most singular quality. And the Duke received them all with grave courtesy, and forgot every one of their faces the moment his wife came into the room. Marjorie dressed the bride and wept, and was scolded fondly for it. Mrs. Quennell was not asked, and sent unasked a stiff letter of congratulation that Ottilie answered with a kindness her stepmother would spend the rest of her narrow life failing to understand, and on the first plain grey morning of their marriage, in no company at all, Gerald, Duke of Kestbeck, who had made himself feared across 3 counties, so that he need never again be deceived, who had leaned his whole weight for 6 years against a door to keep his heart shut, came down early and found her already at the long table by the eastward window, in the light, an ordinary cup of tea between her ordinary hands, waiting for him with the same quiet composure that had cut clean through all his armour in a stranger's ballroom. She looked up and smiled, and it was not the smile she gave the county. It was the plain one, the true one, the one she had been giving no one for one of anyone worth the giving. He crossed the room to her. He would go on crossing rooms to her, gladly every remaining morning of his life, and he understood, at last and for good, standing there in the honest light with the woman that everyone he had ever known had looked straight past, that he had not brought her into the light at all. She had been the light. He had only at long last come in and out of the cold to sit in it, and he sat and took her chapped and lovely hand across the table, and never once let it go.